Hello, I am Peter Litchfield, the president of the Graduate School of Breathing Sciences, and it is my pleasure today to talk to you about breathing. Specifically, I'm going to be talking to you about overbreathing. Overbreathing is typically a function of having learned a bad breathing habit, what we call dysfunctional breathing. Most people think of breathing in terms of oxygen, relaxation, meditation, yoga, this kind of thing. But I'm not going to be talking about that here today. I'm going to be talking about something that perhaps you know nothing about, some very startling kinds of information about how breathing affects us. That is, breathing actually controls or regulates fundamental acid-base physiology. It actually determines from moment to moment what the pH is, for example, of your blood plasma and other what we call extracellular fluids in the body. So that when we deregulate the reflex mechanisms that regulate pH and other physiological considerations, we can get all kinds of radical symptoms and deficits in our psychology as well as in our physiology, which unfortunately we usually attribute to other causes and don't really understand that these symptoms and deficits come about by virtue of the habits that we have unconsciously learned in our lives. Before going on, I'd like to introduce to you some statistics. These are really amazing statistics. Perhaps you didn't know it, most of us don't, that about 60% of the 911 calls in the United States in our major cities like New York and Chicago are a function of symptoms that are brought on by dysfunctional breathing habits, specifically overventilation or overbreathing, which I'll tell you about shortly. In fact, surveys show that about 10 to 25% of the U.S. population at large are suffering with the effects of learned overbreathing habits. That's quite remarkable. And when you look further at people who suffer with other kinds of health issues, people who've had physical injuries or psychological challenges like trauma, that more than 50% of these people out there are suffering the effects of dysfunctional breathing, the symptoms and deficits of which they typically attribute to their existing condition, rather than understanding that the breathing habits that they have learned may be exacerbating, that is, exaggerating those symptoms, or perhaps adding additional symptoms, which they then assume that is somehow a function of some other problem they're dealing with. So this video, as I say, is one of 3 different videos we'll be doing, where we've called it Unexplained Symptoms and Deficits because, as you probably know, a great number of the symptoms and deficits seen in medicine are really unexplained. And it happens that dysfunctional breathing can contribute to that significantly. Let me introduce myself and where I come from first before proceeding. As I mentioned, I head up a school called the Graduate School of Breathing Sciences. And this is an interdisciplinary master's degree program that we offer to healthcare practitioners. There's about 16 of us on the faculty. We're all physicians or psychologists for the most part. And we all come from different fields. We've tried to bring together, tried to integrate the different sciences into one place so people who are really interested in doing effective work with breathing can essentially gather that knowledge and then bring it into their professions in a meaningful way. Now here, let's start off with some misconceptions. Many people believe that, for example, that big breaths are always good. Obviously, big breaths are necessary if you're running a race or doing something like that. But by and large, big breaths work against you, not for you, as you'll see. You really want to take gentle breaths, small breaths, not big breaths. A lot of us believe that carbon dioxide is bad, for example, that part of what breathing is about is getting rid of all the carbon dioxide that our body creates through metabolism. This is simply untrue. Carbon dioxide is a precious substance in the body. It is essential to good health. Good breathing means retaining the right amount of carbon dioxide in our systems at all times. Or that underbreathing, a lot of people believe, is very common and that we just don't breathe enough. The fact is quite to the contrary. Underbreathing is quite rare, not common. It's overbreathing that we find common. A lot of people believe that slow breathing is good, period. Well, slow breathing can be quite good, but people can also be doing very dysfunctional kinds of breathing while they breathe slowly. Or that fast breathing is bad. It's not necessarily bad at all. It might be very, necessary for what you're doing. And as long as you are doing a balanced kind of breathing, as you'll see, fast breathing can be just fine. Or that diaphragmatic breathing somehow is always good. This is simply not true. Diaphragmatic breathing can be just as dysfunctional as any other kind of breathing. So we need to distinguish between what we call breathing mechanics and breathing chemistry. And these things need to be aligned if we're doing good breathing. Breathing mechanics is about moving air in and out of the lungs as we've all always thought, like how deeply do you breathe, how fast do you breathe, how rhythmically do you breathe in the diaphragm, do you breathe in the chest, and it involves the use of muscles. Breathing chemistry, on the other hand, is about moving oxygen out of the lungs to the cells that require it. And it's also about transporting carbon dioxide back from those cells to the lungs and excreting some of that carbon dioxide, but maintaining a certain portion of it in the circulatory system at large. We need to allocate the carbon dioxide properly. Then there's the subject of breathing and respiration. They aren't really the same thing. Breathing is really much more than respiration because we use breathing for many purposes, not just for transporting air. We use it to communicate. We use it to speak the language that I'm speaking right now. I need air to generate the words that are coming from my mouth. But breathing does a lot more than that. It serves us psychologically in some very important ways, I think, that you'll understand by the time we get through with our brief presentation today. So let's move on from here and look further at breathing chemistry and understand that breathing regulates these things that I have listed out here. Believe it or not, breathing plays a major role in maintaining electrolyte balance, in hemoglobin chemistry, in blood flow at large, even in kidney function and in muscle function, in cardiac electrophysiology. It plays a major role in the regulation of our physiology. Most people don't realize that. They think that breathing is just about oxygen or other considerations around that. It's really so much more than that. And here's a very basic thing for you to understand that comes from the field of breathing science, okay? This is maybe a little technical for you, but it's a respiratory equation. It says that pH, that is the acid-base balance, for example, of your blood plasma, is equal to a certain substance in your body called a buffer, called a bicarbonate in this case, divided by the level of carbon dioxide in your blood. Now, these bicarbonates are regulated by the kidney, and the CO2 is regulated by your breathing. So the pH in your blood plasma, which boils down to electrolyte balance and so on, is equal to this fixed consideration around the kidney, that is the concentration of bicarbonates, divided by the way you breathe. And so if you have a bad habit and this carbon dioxide level isn't regulated properly, you're going to disrupt the pH level. You're going to get a change in pH that can produce all kinds of problems that we'll look briefly at in just a moment. So we have acid-base balance here, as I mentioned, equal to bicarbonates divided by carbon dioxide, but we can translate that into other statements like body fluid pH or acid-base pH in body fluids is the kidneys divided by the lungs. Or we can say body fluid pH is an acid buffer divided by breathing. Or we could say physiological change is equal to acid buffer divided by breathing mechanics. Or here in blue, symptoms equals physiology divided by learned breathing habits. And that's really the message here. Or rather than symptoms, performance. Your performance, like public speaking, doing a sport, is equal to physiology divided by learning breathing habits. So how do these learning breathing habits affect us? Well, here are two considerations here. When that equation I went over with you is unbalanced, you can either get overbreathing or underbreathing. Now, as I mentioned, underbreathing is quite out of the normal, but overbreathing is extremely common. And what it means is that you have removed too much carbon dioxide from your blood by taking breaths that are too big or breathing too rapidly, a combination of those two. You could be breathing very rapidly, but taking small breaths and be just fine. Or you could be breathing very slowly, taking large breaths and not be fine at all. So when you remove too much CO2, your fluids become too alkaline. Your blood plasma becomes too alkaline. You become what we call hypocapnic, which means too little CO2. And it's common, and it accounts for most of these amazing 911 statistics that I mentioned to you. Underbreathing means that you're retaining too much carbon dioxide. That's called being hypercapnic, too much CO2. Now this is rare because generally the reflexes take care of that. And if you feel like you're not getting enough air, believe me, you're going to try to breathe more and correct the situation right away. In the case of overbreathing, it's a different issue. It's a different issue, as you'll see. Okay, here's what overbreathing is about again, and here are some of the examples of what happens when you overbreathe. These are some physiological changes. For example, blood vessels constrict in the brain as a result of overbreathing, that is, of a low CO2 level, and can reduce blood flow by at least 50%, up to 60%. Imagine that in a matter of 60 seconds or 30 seconds. Bronchial muscles constrict in the lungs, which make it more difficult to breathe. Cardiac electrophysiology is altered and can trigger things like arrhythmias. Or smooth muscle in your gut can aggravate things like irritable bowel syndrome and other kinds of problems that you may be suffering with. And the hemoglobin in your blood can be altered and actually compromise the distribution of oxygen. So even though you have plenty of oxygen in your body, it isn't being distributed properly because the hemoglobin is holding on to it as a result of carbon dioxide levels that are too low. Here are some of the kinds of symptoms and deficits that you may come across. Emotional ones, where you get a triggering of anxiety, a triggering of anger or panic, all kinds of stress symptoms that can be generated by overventilating and by getting rid of too much of that carbon dioxide, overbreathing. You can get cognitive shifts when that blood flow is reduced in the brain so dramatically, it can lead to attention deficit or poor memory and learning deficiencies. It can interfere with communicating, socializing, working, resting, and exercising. It can play a major role in performance, in sports, and test taking, and public speaking, and operating equipment. It can produce all kinds of physical symptoms like dizziness and pain, headache, Consider, for example, when you reduce blood flow to the brain, your brain isn't getting enough sugar, and you're suffering from low blood sugar in the brain, and you get a headache. You can get numbness, fatigue, sleep disturbances, or psychological changes. Believe it or not, you can get personality changes in the same way you do when you drink too much alcohol. Same kind of thing. You don't have enough carbon dioxide in the brain, and it shuts down blood supply, and you can get personality shifts. You can get disoriented, disconnected, and dissociated. And it can exacerbate or exaggerate symptoms brought on by other problems you may have. Like if you have asthma, it can bring on asthma symptoms. Or if you're epileptic, it can bring on seizures. Or it can bring on high blood pressure if you have a high blood pressure problem, and so on. It's really quite amazing how breathing can affect our physiology and bring on all kinds of symptoms and deficits. Here's an example. In this graph, this is this lower part here. This is carbon dioxide. And you can see it started over here to the left, and it came down this particular person. And as the carbon dioxide level came down, this is a normal level here with this red line here you see across the screen. And so the person started normal, and it came down, down, and down. And look what happened to heart rate. Heart rate surged upward here. It started out at somewhere maybe around 75, and it's gone off the chart here up over 100, simply as a result of lowering the CO2 level. Now here's an anecdotal example. Give you a good feel for how it's involved. These slides, by the way, are available to you. They're available to everyone who's listening on, and you can keep those slides, a PDF copy of these slides. In this particular case, in this particular individual, a businessman, resting actually triggered overbreathing in him. Whenever he would rest, he would start to overventilate and get all kinds of symptoms. So he would unpredictably end up in the hospital. He would call 911, and he would go by ambulance to the hospital. He just felt like he couldn't get enough oxygen, that he had pain and pressure in his chest, and he would feel panicked. And when he would get to the hospital, no one could explain to him why he had these symptoms. His symptoms were a mystery, and it happened over and over again in his life. One day on a flight to Europe, he found himself with the same kind of problem where he just felt like he couldn't breathe. He couldn't get enough oxygen. There was pain. There was pressure in his chest. He was panicked, and they were going to have to land the airplane in some city over the United States before they went over the ocean on its way to Europe. They were going to have to actually land the plane. But before that happened, he managed to get control of his situation, and they flew on to Europe. When he ended up there, he ended up in emergency. The same thing that had been happening to him month in and month out for a very long time. So what did we do? We did a little test here, and you can see here on this slide. These are his carbon dioxide levels here. And we had a little test here. I don't know if you can see it, but this is green down here, and this is red. This is green, this is red, this is green. And we had him, his carbon dioxide levels are normal here, about 40. And we had him sit back and rest easy for a couple of minutes. And his CO2 level dropped down to a seriously low level, about 30 during that resting period. Then I had him imagine something that was difficult in his life, a challenge in his life that he faced at work and was hard for him. And as he imagined that challenging event, his CO2 went up to as high here as 42 or 43. That's nice and high. It's not too high. It's really very good. And then I had him do some math problems. I had him sit back and rest again and take it easy. And when he started to rest, he dropped down to a very seriously low level of CO2 that could trigger all kinds of symptoms. Then I had him imagine again doing some mathematical problems in his head. And as he did those math problems, his CO2 level went back up to the low 40s, which was very good. And then I had him sit back and rest again, and he dropped down to a level where you can almost faint. This can make you sick to your stomach. You can get nausea, totally dizzy and disoriented when he tried to sit back and relax. Again, then I had him do a challenge where I had him write backwards with his left hand. He's right-handed, and it was hard for him to write his name backwards, and I had him do it over and over again, and his CO2 levels went back into the normal range, not nearly as good as they were originally. And then I had him relax again, and he went way down to these very seriously low levels. And then I introduced another challenge, and back again, he's up over 40, and then I had him sit back and relax for about 4 minutes, and he just struggled with it badly. Well, subsequently, what we did is we did a little visualization where we had him imagine he was getting on the airplane. And when we had him imagine getting on the airplane, walking down the ramp, getting on the plane, sitting down, the door of the plane closed, the engine started up, he suddenly felt like he couldn't get enough air, he couldn't breathe, and he was panicking right in the office. So then we coaxed him, his CO2 levels dropped down to a level where he almost fainted, and he was nauseous and he was panicking, and then we worked with him to get the CO2 levels back up, and he was back to normal. So what did we do? How did we help him? And this is what I'm going to pass on to you today before we end. What could we do to help him? And so I'm going to talk to you about what we did with him and what you might try if you have problems like this, or if in your life you suffer with real stressful episodes, anxiety episodes, or times that are really challenging to you. So what can you do this? Well, here are some things to understand. First of all, I'd like you to remember that a bad habit is something specific to you. The solution to this kind of problem, there is no generic solution that everyone can go out and use some kind of protocol that's going to deal with this problem. Ultimately, you need to learn about your own habit and learn to overcome the habit. And we have video 2 and video 3 where we're going to learn a lot more about these things, and we're just going to introduce it to you briefly right now. So I'd like you to keep in mind that ultimately the solution is about allowing your breath. It's not about controlling it, okay? It's about allowing your breath. So I ask you right now, how do you feel right now? And you can do this after this little video you're listening today. Notice how you're feeling, your breathing feels right now. Do you feel like you're getting enough air? Do you feel like you're struggling with your breath? Do you notice that you're trying to take the breaths, or are you really allowing the breaths? Do you feel stressed right now? Do you feel upset or anxious or challenged or worried? Do you feel any physical symptoms like any tingling or dizziness or disorientation or fatigue or pain or anything like that? Take note of that and notice how you're breathing, and notice whether you're taking the breath or you're trying to manipulate it somehow. The message here is to be the breath, not to do the breath, but to be the breath. And what does this mean? It means stepping away from your breathing. So you observe it, you watch it, you feel it, you notice the nuances, you allow the breath, you avoid manipulating the breath. Now you'll learn more about how to do this in the next video and the video after that. But here are some things to do between now and then if you're interested. Focus on the exhale. See how slow it gets. The slower it gets, the better. Say to yourself, if it's getting slow, this is good. Don't push the air out, because if you do, you're going to try to take a deep breath. Allow it out. Give it time. And then wait for the inhale. Avoid taking the breath. Allow it to come by itself. Let the breath be gentle, quiet, small. Make it quiet. Do it for 5 minutes. How do you feel now? Has anything changed? Try this when you feel challenged, when you feel overwhelmed or anxious or stressed. Learn to be the breath. Don't do the breath. So in the next video we're going to do together, it's about the dysfunctional habits that you can learn and how vicious circle they become. These habits can be insidious. You don't realize they're there, and they can stay with you for a lifetime, triggering unexplained symptoms and deficits year after year. Now, if you think you might have a dysfunctional habit, you might consider signing up for the workshop that Shambhala and the graduate school are going to be doing in January. Or you can complete a checklist and send it to us at the graduate school, and we can give you some feedback. If you're interested in breathing and perhaps becoming a practitioner or integrating this in to the work you already do as a practitioner, visit our website and learn about our MS degree in Applied Breathing Sciences. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to talking to you in our next video. Take care.